Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Rare Book Room. My name is Nicholas. I help direct the events here at the Strand. I want to extend a special shout-out to C-SPAN for filming tonight's event. Thank you very much. For a little bit of history about the Strand, it was founded in 1927 over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until after over 92 years. Strand is the sole survivor, still run by the Bass family, the original family who founded it. We're running 400 events a year nearly, and we still house new and used books after all this time. Tonight we are excited to be hosting Andrew Marantz, author of the brand new book, Antisocial, Online Extremists, Techno-Utopians, and the Hijacking of the American Conversation. Andrew has written for The New Yorker since 2011 and has also appeared in Harper's, New York Magazine, Mother Jones, The New York Times, among others, and contributed to the New Yorker Radio Hour and Radiolab. Joining him is fellow New Yorker staff writer Vinson Cunningham, who is the magazine's co-theater critic. His byline has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, New York Times Magazine and Book Review, Fader, Vulture, The All, and McSweeney's Internet Tendency. He's currently teaching in Sarah Lawrence's MFA Writing course. I couldn't be more excited to hear from them all about our informational landscape and how it's been transformed, monopolized, and radicalized, and what its creators and inhabitants have to say about the results. With that in mind, please join me in welcoming Vinson and Andrew to the Strand.
So you mount these precarious chairs. This is like a
I think we can do it.
collapse waiting to happen.
I think we made it.
Okay. It's great to be here with you, man.
Yeah, you too.
So it's right there in the title, sort of, right? You have set out to really draw what I think of as a triangle, right? There are these online extremists that you, I guess, took the bullet for all of us in in exposing yourself to.
Yeah.
Techno-utopianists, right? These people in sort of the top of the tech world. And the implied third part of the triangle is us, right? Like squares who work for The New Yorker.
Normies, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I'd love to just sort of trace all parts of that triangle. And the first thing I want to ask is just about the question that a lot of people sometimes ask, I think, is like, why would you spend your time with these people? A lot of people say, why give them oxygen or something like that? What was the impulse that made you say, no, it's really important that we understand who they are?
Yeah. And it's a good question on multiple levels to wonder why put yourself through that psychologically and why give it oxygen, why legitimate it. And I didn't want to be flip about that because the question of when to avoid normalization and how to avoid normalization is, I think, should be on everybody's mind constantly these days, and to not become inured to things that should be marginal and should be incredible. But basically, 2014-ish, I was very interested in what the internet was doing to us psychologically, societally, and sort of seeing it more as a business story, like, okay, there's no logical limit to how weird and Darwinian and bleak the internet can get.
Right.
There's no, and for a specific reason, there aren't great checks on any American businesses. But this specifically because of the First Amendment, among other reasons, the internet is made up of speech acts, and speech acts can't really be regulated in any way, and I think that's to the good, but it also means that things can get really weird really fast, and there can be this kind of Darwinian clickbait death spiral that happens. And this was all before politics entered into it. This was just me sort of thinking through what it would do to news, what it would do to the information ecosystem. I was at the New Yorker sort of talking to people about just clickbait mills that sort of seemed kind of amoral and kind of, like cat gifs and that kind of stuff. And I was getting really worked up about it and be like, no, you don't understand.
These cats!
Yeah. And they were like, we get it, but just chill out. Like we're old school, but we don't have to like look down our nose on what the kids are doing on the internet. And I was like, no, it's not that. It's that there's nothing preventing them from taking over the whole internet.
Yeah.
And thus everything. If the internet is everything, and the internet is governed by the Darwinian rules of virality,
Right.
then we're screwed, right? I didn't know, no one could really argue me out of how that didn't mean we were screwed.
Yeah.
So I went to Chicago to hang out with this one clickbait entrepreneur. Again, this is all like obviously Donald Trump was a thing, but he wasn't like, he wasn't the thing. He hadn't come down the escalator. And I was just sort of like, well, and this kid, this is where the techno-utopian thing comes in. This guy was like a 26-year-old, just like making money on Facebook like you do when you're 26. And he was like, I'm an innovator, I'm a disruptor, I want to change the world. They never say I want to change the world for the better. They just say like, I want to change the world, right? And they just assume that will just automatically happen for the better. That's part of the techno-utopian thing.
Right.
And he was like, well, there's all these ways that the market can be made more efficient, and it's kind of this meritocracy, and we can tip elections with virality, we can change the world with virality. And I kept just sort of posing essentially just one obvious question over and over, like, how do you know the change is going to happen in the right direction?
Right.
And he would just get really prickly and be like, you're a Luddite, you don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, okay, there's an ideology underlying this that is really faith-based, that isn't rational, even though these guys pride themselves on rationality.
Mm-hmm.
Then Donald Trump comes down the escalator, and then I'm like, okay, now we are really screwed. Because there was like a 2-week window where collectively as a nation we could have said, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And not enough of us did. And then I was like, okay, well, if the Darwinian internet, the reason I keep using the word Darwinian is that there's this sort of riff in the book about the word fit. In the old sense, all the news that's fit to print, which presupposes a human with morals and values and thoughts that is making the decision about fitness.
Right.
And then there's the Darwinian sense of fitness, which is just, there is no human at the helm, it's just algorithms duking it out. So, yeah, throw Trump into that, and I was like, okay, well, I don't feel sanguine at all about not only the outcome of this election, but also just the future of our democracy. And then because of the way we sort of operate at The New Yorker, I was like, okay, instead of sitting here and opining about it, I'm going to go out into the world and try to watch it happen in a kind of fly-on-the-wall way.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned that sort of, that faith that things won't change for the absolute worst. And what I think, what's an amazing thematic thread all the way through the book is that, like, you show how much that's not just a tech belief. That's a national belief. You use the Obama via King phrase about the arc of the moral universe bending. It's like, okay, but who's bending it and in which direction?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, I didn't use this King thing in the book, but it doesn't happen on the wheels of inevitability.
Right.
There's multiple, the myth making of America is such that we can draw on Lincoln or King or Whitman or whatever in these very specific and, kind of, heavily curated ways,
right,
where we can remember the King that says, we're going to live up to our ideals and it's all going to work out. But we don't remember the King that's like, oh, we're all going to have to like go to jail and like boycott things, and like things
right,
are going to have to happen in order to get there.
Right.
And the way that kind of filters into the consciousness of people, let's just say hypothetically, you spend a couple semesters at Harvard and then you drop out and, you go to Palo Alto and like start a company. Hypothetically, you're not thinking very hard about, you're not wrestling with this stuff. You're not like, reading sort of revisionist histories of how American exceptionalism works, and you're not.
Right.
Basically, I'm just saying humanities majors should rule the world, and we never will, but we should. But
Yeah.
the reason that that's not purely sour grapes, and that it actually I think has material consequences, is that if you just sort of absorb the national myth,
right,
that has never really made much sense, but that just kind of makes you sleep better at night. When you go build something that might turn into the world's largest platform for human discourse, you don't build it in a way that has safeguards built into it.
Right.
There's a metaphor of a party where, if you start a party and you just sort of say, hey, everybody come on in, and like we'll just hope that it'll all be great, and the arc of this party will bend toward justice. And then you're like, okay, but what if things start happening? Like what if somebody starts poisoning the drinks, or starts a rumor that people are poisoning the drinks, and there's like a stampede for the door? Like, you didn't check IDs, you don't have an exit sign,
right,
you don't have a PA system, you're just sort of hoping that it's going to work out. And then, now you have 2.4 billion people at your party.
And to me, the power of that phrase too was, and you mentioned Obama sometimes in this book, right? You talk about a speech that he gives in the Middle East when he says, nobody can hide from the truth anymore because of the sort of sunlight as disinfectant, like, nature of the internet. And I wonder if, like, there's a subtle critique that specifically over these past, let's say 15 years or whatever, we've all been sort of lulled to sleep. Like, you know, I think there's a Obama critique somewhere in there.
Yeah, well, it actually weirdly is a critique that runs through Reagan, Obama. There's this weird thing where on the way to one of these kind of propaganda, kind of professional misogynist Islamophobes' houses, like childhood homes, I land at a Chicago airport and drive into rural Illinois, and on the way pass through Reagan's hometown. And Reagan, there's a plaque with Reagan saying the same thing. I'm very optimistic about our future. Let's all, play to the better angels of our nature. I mean, really Lincoln all the way through.
Yeah.
There's this trying to, put a nice sort of positive spin on, what is essentially, I mean, in Lincoln's case, just like rotting corpses and like the worst of us, but like let's just think about the best of us. And that happens with Reagan, Bush's, Obama, Clinton's, for sure Clinton's. That it's like, I get why it's a good stump speech, but it's not good policy, and it doesn't help us. Look, and then there's this weird thing that happens where you could get stuck on the flip side of it and go like, no, what we actually are is just sort of doomed to pessimism about ourselves. And I just don't think either of those things gets very far. I just think it's like, you can give a speech in 2010 in Egypt that says sunlight is the best disinfectant, but guess what? If you go back to Egypt in 2012 or 2013, you're going to get laughed out of the room if you give that speech, right? So it's like, it's both. You can't just, and what the Arab Spring is a good example where the internet guys, the techno-utopians, they love talking about the Arab Spring. You don't hear them talking about the Muslim Brotherhood very often. Yeah. But they just both are facets of our history. You can't have one without the other. So your original question was why pay attention to online extremists.
Right.
That's why, because if you only do one and not the other, we all know the story of, 3 guys in hoodies got in a garage and started a company and it changed the world, right? The reason the book is Antisocial is not that like this is my polemic that is anti-social media. It's that we've assumed for so long that the internet can only ever be pro-social, in the sense of weaving together our social fabric and bending the arc in the right direction. If we ignore the other side of the coin, the antisocial side, whether it's 40% or 60% or whatever, is kind of immaterial. It's a lot. Whatever it is, it's a lot. And we ignore it at our peril. Yeah. And so then I was just like, well, I have to see. The other weird thing is that they're fine with you knocking on their door and letting them in. I mean, this is the weird thing about fly on the wall, long form reporting. You never know who's going to be okay with you coming in, and these people were the last people I would expect to be like, sure, New Yorker guy with glasses and whatever, like, come on in. But they, and some people slammed the door in my face. Alex Jones chickened out at the last minute. I was bummed about that.
Chickened out as in you talked to him and he said no, nothing, or before you, what was the process? He
was down. He was like, yeah, I've got nothing to hide and I've got a massive operation and and he's done profiles before. I was trepidatious because of the oxygen thing, but then I was like, this guy has a massive audience. I'm not going to make or break Alex Jones. Only Twitter can do that, and they did.
Yeah.
But at the time they hadn't. And there was a whole thing. I don't think the New Yorker is kind of like a minor character in the book, and I didn't include any of this stuff because I was struggling with how meta to get. On the one hand, you don't want to be too navel-gazing. On the other hand, the way these things happen is part of the story of how media is produced in the 21st century is part of the theme of the book. So I was like, there's a lot of stuff about how the New Yorker does things in a kind of proudly non-internet-y way, and that not in a non-clickbait death spiral-y way. And so but I didn't get into this, but there was a whole thing where like, David Remnick was like, you got to put me on the phone with Alex Jones because we've got to settle that, we've got to make arrangements. And I was like, as much as I would really like to be in the room for that, I don't think he's the biggest fan, and I don't know if that would really help that much. And he's like, just set up a phone call. But then Alex chickened out. He wouldn't get on the phone.
That's so funny.
But so I didn't do that one, but I did. But the thing is, like, I ended up going to, Orange County, California, and sitting with this dude who was kind of he was an InfoWars contributor, among other things. He was also like a lawyer and a married guy, and had a dog and a kid, but was also just out there and was just like, I really think that Hillary has a undiagnosed neurological condition, and I'm going to edit video footage of her like blinking in a way that seems suggestive. And you could never really get to the bottom of like, do you believe this, or are you just thinking that it's effective propaganda? Because sometimes he would say, well, of course I believe it, give me a polygraph or whatever. And then other moments he would kind of sort of winkingly be like, I just know what is going to go viral,
Right.
And I know I have a policy outcome I want, which is I want to win this election for Trump. And I know that my sort of abstract notions about Saudi Arabian policy are not going to get us there, so I'm just going to do this blinking thing, and that's going to get us there. And then I would watch him do it. I mean, the thing that was wild is that these weren't state-owned Russian troll farms. These were it was literally a dude in Orange County and
Right.
a bunch of people that he was connected to through Skype podcasts and, WhatsApp chains and just whatever, who would sort of informally coordinate, and I would show up at his house and he'd be like, okay, so like watch me do this thing. And he'd set up a iPad and do a Periscope video. And all the commenters, it would be like, hardcore 2,000 hardcore fans. And they'd be like, okay, what's our hashtag? What are we going to do? And they'd be like, Hillary's seizures. No, that's not quite. Hillary, stuttering Hillary, coughing Hillary. Like, and they'd kind of workshop it.
Okay.
And then they would pick one and they'd get it trending. And then once it's trending on Twitter, Twitter is where all the journalists are. And the journalists would see it and Matt Drudge would see it. And then it would jump over to Fox News, and then from Fox News it would jump to CNN, and then literally I would be like in my hotel room in Orange County, pick up the newspaper and be like, that guy did this.
Right.
This headline is in the newspaper because of what I watched the guy do yesterday. So yes, it's marginal, but it's so also not marginal. Yeah. It's so one of the things that the internet does is break down all barriers between the fringe and the mainstream, between what's little and what's big. It's this metaphor of infection.
Yeah.
So you can be some weird virus off in the middle of nowhere, but if you get on the right jetliner, you're everywhere.
So speaking of the sort of juxtaposition of that incredibly dark phenomenon, and as you say, the New Yorker as the secondary character, I want to read one of my favorite passages from this book real quickly. You say, for much of 2015 and 2016, while everyone I knew was incredulous of the notion that Donald Trump thought he could be president, I was in my office on the 38th floor of the World Trade Center, reading such blog posts as Global Elite's Secret Plan Revealed, and The Rational Racist, and Misogyny Gets You Laid. Whenever a colleague walked in and saw what was on my screen, I scrambled to say several things that should have gone without saying. I was not reading up on the merits of bigotry because I was open to being convinced. I was not scouring the internet rumor mill for titillation or to scratch a contrarian itch. Something was happening, and I was trying to figure out what it was. So yeah, how was it doing this at the New Yorker? I mean, it's just like the worlds could not be more incongruent, and the speech codes, the ways of being, and you're this emissary to the heart of darkness. How does that, on a day-to-day basis? Because I think I think another one of the themes of this book is what it's like to be a journalist and what you have to do in pursuit of the truth.
Yeah. Yes, it was weird. and I did have these moments of being like, I almost could get a vicarious picture of the thrill of why these people did find it titillating, even though I was constantly mortified.
Yeah.
I could understand like this feeling of forbidden. There's so few things in life that are still forbidden. It's like you can't even like Kanye's out here talking about being a porn addict. Like nothing, there's no boundaries anymore. Like everybody can just do everything. And so to actually find the few things in life that you're not supposed to look at, I understood vicariously the thrill of it.
Yeah.
But I also, so I could feel my brain be split into trying to understand but not excuse, or trying to empathize but not go native, like trying to be like, okay, I get why if you're a certain type of person in a certain type of milieu, you would want to be drawn to this, but also not losing my moral compass. Because to your point about the part of the book that is about what a journalist is supposed to be, there is this fundamental perhaps irresolvable clash between pursuing the truth and like keeping a kind of moral compass. Like there's a kind of journalism where the moral compass part is really under theorized, and you're not really supposed to. This is where you get a lot of. I think I use a phrase at some point about like being like an astoundingly frictionless weather vane, which is my like sort of catty dig at like journalists who I think are doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Which is like, don't just go, and it sounds obvious and abstract to not just go where the wind blows, but you see it all over the place with this stuff where people will say, some people say this is divisive, provocative rhetoric, and there have been complaints that it has raised eyebrows. Like, come on, just say what it is.
Right.
But I think where that confusion is coming in is that you don't want to seem... Look, it's weird to live in a world where the president is an idiot and a liar. So to say that sounds like you're being biased, although it is the plain fact. But to say it, it feels weird even to me to say it.
Right.
And it feels somehow unjournalistic to say it, even though that is precisely the job of journalism. It's just not the only job. There's one job, which is to tell the truth, and there's the other job, which is to sound even-handed. And they can't always be done at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so it's not only the president, it's also the whole notion of trolls and the whole notion of internet shitstirrers, and like what they exist to do is to put you in situations that you cannot describe without being tendentious, because to describe them neutrally is to miss the point. I had a lot more New Yorker stuff in early drafts, as you know, and
I read this book very early on. It was the gift that keeps on giving.
It kept on giving. It was way too long, but it was also no. But it was also, and my wife was a very tough on me on this. She read this manuscript many times, and we had many conversations about how to deal with the New Yorker of it all, because on the one hand, it's clear why the temptation is there to be like, okay, if I'm going to talk about the way these people do media, it's sort of weird and dishonest to not talk about the way I do media. On the other hand, there's this weird kind of like almost just to mention the New Yorker is kind of like a just weird flex in its own right, and it's like it become like there's a thing where I'm quoting one of these people the day after the election, and he's like, a vote for Trump was a vote against smug elitist assholes. And when I go to quote that in the web piece I'm doing for the New Yorker, they put a little accent over the E in elitist. Yeah. And I was like, God damn it. So I wanted to talk about that multi-layering effect in the book, but even to talk about it was to play into the multi-layered effect of it, Yeah. So I didn't want to fall into that trap, but I didn't want to just pretend I didn't notice it. Yeah. That the trap is there. And like, to get right down to it, there are different kinds of elitism, and most of them are bad. But if by elite, I don't think this is technically elitism, but I think there's a kind of slippage between actual elitism and this notion of making decisions based on taste, which goes against this Darwinian notion of like, we'll just let the marketplace of ideas sort it out. Right. So there's obviously the bad caricature of elitism, and then there's the thing that you want to preserve, which is the like, no, you don't get to just both sides this, or you don't get to just say this because it feels right, or your arguments don't scan, or so, and that there is like, in addition to the deep preoccupation in the book with like how we're skating on thin ice as a country, and we have this sort of history of white supremacy that we've never like really grappled with, and like yada yada, all that stuff. There's also the media of it all, which is like there is nowhere, the Constitution guarantees that the government can't shut down the press. It doesn't guarantee what the press means, or whether it will be any good, or whether it will actually serve democratic aims, or whether it will have a business model that continues to function. There's nothing. It's just this vertiginous feeling of like, oh, there is no safety net. There's just a like, you hope that people want to buy what you're selling, but it turns out if you actually test it rigorously in the marketplace of ideas, the cat gifts win. Yeah. Like they just do. Yeah. So there's this like this, oh, let the marketplace sort it out. It's like, have you ever seen what the marketplace does when it sorts things out? Like,
all bad. Yeah.
yeah, not all, but like pretty.
And there's, I mean, it's so funny that you talk about that sort of fundamental. I hate to make the New Yorker the underdog, but there is this sort of inequality that sort of there's a weenieism that talks about this other American strand. You talk about, I think another really funny part of your book is like you talk about yourself, right? We all kind of conceive of ourselves as anti-elite, or you have this really funny thing like when I was a kid, there were no Kurt Cobain posters that said on them, "Some norms are worth preserving." Like we all grow up with this idea of defining ourselves against something. So of course that like rebel sensibility, there are a lot of people that like in your book that were Bernie Sanders voters in 2016.
Most of them, like,
and then yeah,
most of them come from the left or the far left or the whatever, or they go through this pathway. They call it the libertarian to alt-right pipeline, where they go left libertarian, right libertarian, and it's like whatever. It takes like 60 pages to get there, but basically, Ayn Rand leads to Maria Rothbard, leads to this guy Hans Hermann Hoppe, who's like a German sort of just asking the question, like why can't we, have covenants of freedom of association, blah, 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 Nazi. It's like, there are more steps in the book, but basically, and like, that is a scary thing. And there is this, it is weird to think of the kind of traditional thing as an underdog. Economically, it just sort of is. Like, it's weird to talk about it that way, but it just kind of is the case. There also is this, the reluctant institutionalist thing was the way I kept thinking about it, where you never want to, like when I would show up to these people's parties, so the whole kind of opening section of the book is inauguration weekend, and I'm at this party called the Deplorable, which is a very witty pun, and which because you have to explain it. And they are all, and again, it's this sort of me trying to kind of anthropologically, vicariously go, okay, what is the thrill for them? And the only way I could kind of hit on it was to go, okay, what they're vibing with is the part of me, like the 8th grade part of me that is like, don't tell me not to skateboard on that statue. Like, I'll do it if I want to. And you're like, okay, but the statue you're skating on is called democratic norms. Like, I'm sure it's fun for you right now, but the notion that women should be allowed to work, and like trans people are okay, and like you shouldn't punch people, like those are, like it might feel cool to you to be a renegade and be like, why, prove it, but like just you got to grow up eventually. And I'm talking 40-year-old, 50-year-old, like some of them are 14-year-old trolls in their basement, but a lot of these people are like Gavin McInnes, who founded Vice Media and was just sort of like, I really want to go fight someone because I'm just like, because it's punk and countercultural. And I'm like, your ideas aren't interesting. But this is another thing where there was a part of me in those moments that wanted to say that. Mm-hmm. And there was another part of me that was like, actually, it would be better if I just sort of hold my tongue for like 3 years, give or take, and then say it in the book, because that's sort of what journalism is. It feels weird because it feels like you're kind of, you're playing a persona, but you kind of have to do it to get the goods. And it's weird how many of them, even though they knew who I was and they knew where I came from, just by kind of showing up and shutting up, they get lulled into this thing of like, and not lying. So they appreciate that you're not lying about them. Right. But they kind of forget that you still have a brain and you're still perceiving things that they're doing and forming judgments about them in your head.
And in fact, toward the end, I mean, not a spoiler, but I think some of them are like, at some points, intent that they're gonna like red pill you.
Oh, totally.
Like, we're just waiting for you to make the switch. You're like, I don't think so.
I don't think so, guys. But yeah, a lot of them, because so many of them have switched from either Bernie supporters or, whatever other ideological. Some of them don't have ideologies, but some of them really are like, they just think, well, all this stuff is so flimsy and meaningless anyway. Like, we'll get you too. And I mean, I remember being at the Deplorable and being like, talking to some, just sort of trolly performance artist guy who then, was kind of trying to schmooze me up. And to your question about Oxygen, I was really trying to not give him the time of day because I was just like, I don't want to play into your shtick. And I'm not naive enough to think that there is no transactional nature to any journalistic interaction. So I was like, sometimes it's going to be worth it for me to write about you guys, but I'm still aware that you're using me as much as I'm using you. And so I was trying to kind of stiff arm him and like go away. And then he gets up on the stage and makes his announcement that he's going to be the White House press correspondent for this thing called the Gateway Pundit, which is, I mean, I have a blanket, like, don't Google this stuff in my book rule. But if you do, just do it on an incognito browser because your YouTube will never look the same. But I know from experience, but
I can't believe you did that to yourself, man.
I've had to email with people at Viking, be like, just FYI, just safe browser. They look, this is part of what journalism is like going into weird worlds and weird spaces. And in a way, it's funny how much we are so tripped up on this, like, how much should we know? How much should we look away? It's good that we're tripped up on it because, again, it's good that we're struggling through it. But it's like we don't really do that with, Boko Haram or something. We're not like, should we cover it or not?
Right.
Because I think it just feels far away, and it feels like with this it feels too close, and it feels almost like I think some people are just kind of like, I don't know how much of that I can really refute. I mean, there's this you can go to a place where you're like, I think some people don't want to look at it because they just are kind of like, I don't necessarily want to do the work of actually sussing out how much of this I can explicitly disagree with. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's just kind of like, let's just make it go away. But then once this guy was like making his announcement that he was gonna, my point was he's from the Gateway Pundit, which don't Google it, but it's just like, it's like a I'd say 4.5 tiers below Breitbart web tabloid. And that was that was who he was reporting for from the White House. And I say reporting in air quotes because he wasn't doing jack shit. He was just like there as a troll, as an act of trolling.
Right.
But I was like, okay, I will go with you on the megabus to DC, and I will sit next to you in the megabus as you watch King of the Hill on your laptop and nap. That was like his preparation for the White House. And because he knew, I mean, on the one hand, he was just not a serious person, but on another hand, he knew that his job was not to hold the powerful to account or like come up with the question that was going to break open the Russia scandal. His job was to show up
right.
and freak people out, and he succeeded.
Yeah, and what strikes me so much, I'm sorry, just every time, it just blows my mind every time. And you went into the White House, the press briefing room with all these, performance artists. They're doing under the guise of journalism. It's just, but what's interesting is that you show how it's impossible to ignore for these reasons, right? So they're permeating the White House itself physically, and then on the other hand, at the beginning, at the Deplorable, one of the things that I found so jarring, immediately, which just shows you how important this book is that at the Deplorable with these people is Peter Thiel, somebody who is sort of wrapped in a certain kind of respectability, certainly not anathemized in the way that these other people are. And you show how also the tech elite are implicated. And so I was thinking about your book, obviously, a lot this week, watching Mark Zuckerberg before Congress being peppered on these precise things. What are you doing to keep these people away from our eyes and ears on the internet? And so, I mean, I found myself wondering sort of how you took that all in. And I mean, I think the answer is no, but whether you think that these people have learned any lessons about their power with respect to all of this.
Yeah. So these people being the techno-utopians.
The techno-utopians, yes.
Yeah.
The Thiels and Zuckerbergs
and he was asked about Thiel too. I mean, he was asked directly, like, was your board member Peter Thiel aware of Cambridge Analytica and all these things? So I don't think they've learned nothing. Well, it depends what you mean by learned. I think they have. I think that Mark Zuckerberg is now aware that he cannot just ignore this stuff from a PR perspective. It's just not going to fly. Like, ever since Facebook, before Facebook was Facebook, ever since it was like do you think this girl is hot.com or whatever it was before it was Facebook, he has been breaking rules and then apologizing for them. And I think that's just the strategy. Like, do whatever you want, apologize later. And I think he knows that this one is too big. And by this one, I mean data, I mean privacy, I mean, how do we... So to me, it's not only how do we keep these things out of our eyes and ears, because his strategy recently has been to just rely on this notion of free speech, right? So he gave this big speech at Georgetown last week where he said, we believe in free speech, and because of free speech, speech is good, and the answer to speech that you don't like is more speech, and therefore we're doing fine because free speech. It was 40 minutes of that. And
also referencing Frederick Douglass somehow.
referencing Frederick
like,
Douglass.
I don't think he applies here.
Referencing King again. I mean, it's a little shameless. It's also, it's this very selective reading of American history that goes, and because the facts are accurate. It's like, yes, we have a First Amendment. Yes, Frederick Douglass was a fan of it. Yes.
I'm following, yeah.
So far the logic scans.
Yep.
The parts that are being left out are, okay, because we have a First Amendment and because free speech is good, how does it then follow that that's the only good worth pursuing? That's the only kind of freedom that matters? Like, it's especially offensive to be invoking Douglass and King and be like, the only kind of freedom that matters is everyone's freedom to give me money through their time and attention. Like, that's not what freedom means. That is a kind of freedom if you want to define it extremely narrowly in some kind of newspeak sense, but it's not a robust vision of freedom. And I think the thing that has been left out, this is a Zuckerberg thing, but it's also just, as we talked about earlier, a general society thing. We don't think about freedoms as being, or just rights or big abstract concepts as being able to be in tension with one another or to have complex trade-offs among them. You know, it is a time when things that don't need to be said still need to be said. So I'm going to say the First Amendment is lovely. I love it. Frederick Douglass loved it. Let's not get rid of it. It's wonderful. And I don't want anybody with bad political ideas being sent to jail. So what I'm advocating for is that not be the end of the discussion. Right. And it's just weird to me how often we establish those very, very, very simple facts and then go, all right, are we good? Everybody good? And like, just to imagine if we did that with the Second Amendment, we're like, we have established that, I mean, leaving aside the whole like well-regulated militia doesn't mean off-duty cop or whatever, but like, if you just say, okay, there's a right to bear arms, are we good? Can we go home? Like, no, you can't. These things are thorny and complicated, and to raise the complexity of them flies in the face of this utopianism, this notion that we're done here. Like, we have done our innovative, disruptive work. We have moved fast and broken things, and now it is up to the great arc of history to fix it for us. That era, I think they are sensing, is maybe over. I don't think they're being... I mean, look, the stock price is doing fine. So I don't think they're like feeling it on like a pocket level. And I don't think, but I actually, I'm weirdly, so I'm not the guy you go to for like hope and optimism, but I do weirdly feel that there are levers to push with the techno-utopians that are not all about money. Right. They've got enough of that. And I think even they feel like they've got enough of that, but they have, they want to be luminaries. They want to have legacies. They want to have their names on the side of buildings. I think one lever that we can push as a society is as they move out of their like Alfred Nobel building Dynamite phase and into their like Nobel Prizes phase, we collectively as a society and as journalists and whatever, prevail on that sense of like, are you sure you're helping? Are you really sure? Like, I know you felt like you were helping and we never sort of held you to account for that. But now that you're being held to account a little bit, like, how sure are you? I think that's the only way. That's where I feel like the theater of these congressional hearings is useful. I don't know how much specific law or policy comes out of it, but I feel like shame is a really useful... One of the chapter epigraphs in the book is Sadie Smith, right? Shame gets a bad rep these days. I think shame is really useful. Yeah.
On that note, I would love it if we could get some questions from the audience, whoever would like to pipe up and ask.
While they're lining up, you can throw one more thing out there if you want.
And the other, I mean, yes, I will. Next to all that, the way that you sort of make all of that really dense and resonant in this book is another of my favorite lines, where you say what we need, instead of sort of small piecemeal solutions or trying to like nuke the entire internet. What you say is what we need and urgently is a new moral vocabulary. And you answered it a little bit, but I just wonder how you think that that starts to play out, not only among those titans and barons and, you know, the potential Nobel Prize grandees, but among all of us. How do we start to knit that together? This book seems to me like one of those steps, if I can sell this book to you who are already here. But how do we keep that going?
Yeah. Well, that is where I was kind of able to rationalize my, you know, I think writers are always trying to rationalize why they are at home writing instead of like, you know, on the front lines of some demonstration or doing something more directly socially useful. And that was how I was sort of able to rationalize it to myself, is that like, I do think, not that this book has all the answers, but just that we do need to try to reconceptualize how we can think about these things more coherently and more robustly. And it's weird that a book that is about scenes and characters would be an attempt to try to knit together a new moral vocabulary, and yet that is sort of a reference to this philosopher Richard Rorty, who's kind of hanging over a lot of the concerns in the book, who is a pragmatist and in many ways an anti-philosopher, a very interesting writer, who essentially has this notion that comes from anthropology of like thick descriptions, that the way that we reconceive of ourselves is to thickly redescribe ourselves to ourselves. That we don't get to new moral positions or even really new, like profoundly new political positions by out-arguing each other. Like that there's this kind of Enlightenment tendency to just be like, well, it's either going to be, you know, Lincoln or Douglas, and one of them is going to win, and like that. He makes a very compelling case that that's not actually how society moves forward, and the way it moves forward is by telling better stories. So this is in part an attempt to tell a story that wraps its arms around more than just the kind of, you know, glossy Hollywood version of how we got here.
All right, question over here.
Hi. Firstly, thank you for doing this work over the past couple years so that the rest of us don't have to.
Yeah.
But something that I thought particularly interesting was the discussion of how, you know, there were two sides to when you were thinking about these people. You know, one was I want to understand them, but the other side was I don't want to, you know, overly emphasize and get red-pilled. So I'm curious if there was ever a time when you felt like that line was being maybe not crossed, but blurred. Mm-hmm. And sort of a second part to that question is, you know, how do we as a society overall make sure that we don't go through that red-pilling process or the blurred process even? Yeah, it's a good question. So there's many different kinds of red pilling. So for the normies among us, the red pill metaphor comes from the Matrix, where, you know, you take the red pill and it shows you the truth. And it's like Plato's cave is like this. It's sort of one of our favorite allegories to tell as a society, because that feeling is really addictive and really powerful feeling, the feeling of having secret knowledge. There was never a moment where I was like, you know, it really is the Jews. Like I mean, because there were a couple times when I will say I didn't know that the Jew thing was going to be a hang up for so many of these people. I found that really quaint and kind of like, aw, you guys are still doing that, huh?
There's a really funny moment when the guy, like over the phone, he's like, wait, are you?
Yeah. This was a guy. This was
Jewish?
There's a kind of descent throughout the book into deeper and deeper layers of Nazism, and this is toward the end where you're really meeting the pick of the litter. And there was a guy who I had been circling around talking to his family. Who, I mean, this is kind of like a Philip Roth novel. This guy's story. It's, I mean, not that I did it that way, but just that it is that he was born in like bucolic, idyllic New Jersey. His parents were professors, like the most progressive oat milk like idol that you could imagine, and he then through a series of red pills and also actual steroids, ends up in this place where he's in the darkest of the dark rabbit holes. And there's a lot of things going on, but he's already married to a Jewish woman when he discovers that the Jews are the central problem with the world. So he has to deal with that, presents problems. And so I've been circling around, I've been talking to his parents. One side, his parents are divorced, one side has disowned him, the other side is trying to stick with him, and is actually like, his mom is like, I hear you're going to this rally in Charlottesville, let me buy you some shirts because your other shirts are too baggy and I want you to look good on TV. So those are like the two sides of his experience. He finally calls me. We were actually supposed to go out for Friday dinner. I don't think it was technically a Shabbat dinner, but we were supposed to go out for Friday dinner. And I'm on speakerphone with the guy. And I didn't realize this about me, but I have a journalistic tick where to draw people out, I now know my tick is to go, right, right, right. Like to get them to keep talking. So he's like, that's why we need a white ethno-state in the United States. And I'm like, right, right, right. And my wife runs into the room and is like, could you not agree with the Nazi? And then in the midst of all that, he's about to recommend to me the book that really red-pilled him on the JQ being the Jewish question. And in the middle of that utterance, he goes, wait, you're not a Jew, are you? And I'm like, did you Google me? Did you, like, you have so many facts at your disposal. And then we kept talking for like hours after that. And then we met up for a beer. He wanted me to meet him at a German beer hall. So that, I did not feel almost red-pilled by that guy. But I do take your question, which is like, how do we collectively guard against this stuff? And I don't think censorship is entirely the answer. I think that we have to have guardrails. We have to have better algorithms that aren't built on outrage and emotional engagement and fear and disgust and all the rest of it. But some of it is going to be just building a society in which this stuff is not shocking or rage-baity or titillating, but is just written out of we're just not interested in it anymore. Like, I think it's not emotional engagement in a positive sense or negative sense that's going to get us out of it. I think it's going to be, oh, nobody talks about that stuff anymore.
Here you go, sir.
Yeah, you said you're not the guy to go to for optimism or hope, and obviously the people you've talked to in this story, a lot of them are, it's pretty horrifying. Is there anyone you talked to in the process of this that did give you some hope? Like, is there any bright point in the darkness?
Yeah. I think there are actually a few. So one of the things that, one bright point is that some of these people are darkly funny and actually sometimes just inadvertently pathetically funny, which gives the reader a good amount of schadenfreude. I think they all kind of have a rise and fall arc that you get to end the book on a note of like, oh, I think a lot of these characters are going to politically implode. That doesn't mean that their ideas go away, but it does provide you a level of like, sort of comfort. But the real moments of hope for me are this notion of the arc does move. I think the mistake is to think that the arc moves by itself, but the arc does move. I mean, watching the way that our society has responded post-Trump, Brexit, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Salvini, like, it should not have taken all that. But the fact that the response to that has been such that in the space between when I started working on this and now, we have a totally different way of thinking as a society about the responsibilities that architects of algorithms have, the responsibilities that this entire sector of our economy has. I mean, to go from hagiography to vilifying these guys, I don't think that vilifying them is entirely the answer, but it shows me just how quickly this stuff can move. And I wouldn't have believed that we could move this fast on this kind of stuff. I never thought that, the golden boys of tech innovation would be essentially seen as like tobacco executives 5 years later. So that does give me hope. Not that I think they literally are tobacco executives, but just that I think the Overton window can shift in lots of surprising and interesting directions. And all I'm trying to do is point out that the Overton window can shift in really scary, bad directions. a lot of the time it goes in a really nice direction. The Overton window on same-sex marriage is a really hopeful thing to think about, and that happened because of democratization of media and all the rest of it too. So these are forces that can be marshaled really powerfully to the good. We just have to stop being in denial about the fact that that'll happen on its own.
Well, I'm just curious about this whole, I mean, on some level, is the human brain hardwired in a certain direction toward hate? I mean, I think it's interesting in the age of Trump with, you know, when the rock has been lifted off the hole and all of this kind of hate has seeped, you know, so deeply into society. Is there something about the human brain? You know, I'm just curious because I've you know, in the beginning I found it sort of shocking. Now we've become sort of anesthetized. But at the end of the day, what caused Germany to embrace the Nazi movement? What is allowing people to
think it was
think
economic
that this
anxiety.
kind of group hate is okay?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's I think that it's tough. The hardwired thing is tough. And not to go back to the one of the internal preoccupations of my household is the kind of like struggling with, does free will exist and are we hardwired into everything? And so that was a background preoccupation that my wife and I would argue about when we were arguing about this book. And I think, I mean, again, one of the, this shows up in a footnote when I'm talking about one of the Nazis, was that the philosophy of public defenders, who was, you know, my wife was a public defender, my child is named after the case that gave us public defenders, it's a thing that we believe in our household, but one of the tenets of that is people are not reducible to the worst thing they've ever done. Now that's very, very hard to apply to Nazis. And I don't always get all the way there, and I don't always feel that I should get all the way there. But I don't think that we want to get stuck in like hardwired if that means predetermined or predestined.
Well, no. I mean, I don't believe it's an
Yeah.
excuse.
Yeah, it's not an excuse, and it's also like we want to hold people to account for their ability to be more plastic and more malleable than that. I think that the thing that makes societies descend is the moral vocabulary spinning out of control. And that sounds kind of squishy and soft as opposed to, you know, more hard-nosed things like policy or like, you know, psychology or biology. But I think we exist within social structures and like language games and speech conditions way more than we want to think. And the ability to think that something is not unthinkable but controversial, and then not controversial but actually sort of desirable, and then not desirable but inevitable. Like that, I think, is what leads people into this kind of very dangerous groupthink. So it's like, it's abstract, right?
Yeah.
And obviously material conditions matter and wars matter and, you know, all of that. I'm not discounting any of that. But that's why I worry about that. One of the phrases in the book is to change how we talk is to change who we are. And I mean that in a literal way. And how we talk is a product of the internet, which again is not good. So I think that's where we need to get control of this internet stuff, not just as a business question or not just as a tech media question, but as a who we are question.
Yes.
We got time for a couple more questions.
Hi. You talked about this a little bit in the beginning about how you saw your role in all of this, but I'm wondering what you see the role of journalism kind of going forward. I also cover this stuff, and I think amplification is a huge concern, and I'm wondering, you know, like, how should we be covering this? Like, how should we be looking at this going forward?
Yeah, amplification is a huge concern, and I think, so one baseline thing is that it's always an option, as you know, not to do the story. And I think that option should be exercised a lot. I mean, I think there were many times where, you know, I talked about the guy at the Deplorable who successfully pitched me on his misadventures into DC. Everyone else in that room was pitching me too. I mean, that was a room of 1,000 people who were professional trolls who all wanted me to write about them. So, one of them got me, but 999 of them didn't. And so some of it is just not always amplifying, because amplification is a concern. But another thing is context and how you couch things. There's a kind of uncritical amplification that is just sort of like, and I chronicle, I really tried not to pick on anyone, but I did go back through the early days. I kind of reconstructed how these people learned to be trolls, because they aren't, again, they're not like Internet Research Agency, they're not sitting in some tower in Moscow being secretly told by Putin what to do. They're American citizens operating in plain sight. Most of them are not anonymous. Most of them aren't even breaking the rules of their platforms they're operating on, much less the laws of the land. So when I went back to reconstruct how they did that, a lot of it was through uncritical amplification. It would be like a BuzzFeed piece that was like, OMG, look at the 12 worst people on the internet today, followed by literal cut and paste of all of the stuff they said with links, with their hashtags, so you could go and amplifying their hashtags by being like, I think this hashtag sucks, but like you're posting to it. That stuff, I try not to come down too hard on that, because we were all just learning, and I'm sure that those BuzzFeed writers were doing what they thought was right. And I don't think that staying silent in the face of terrible people on the internet is always the right answer either, right? Because then they kind of look like they're going unchallenged. But I do think now we've learned better than to just uncritically. I think if you're going to do it, first the question of if you're going to do it should be a much bigger question than it is for most journalists. And then it should be, what am I really adding? And can I do it in a way that even if there is some amplification, there's a larger thing that I'm learning. There's a larger pattern that I'm pointing to. I'm actually informing my readers in a way that isn't just like, I can't even with these people.
Got our final question of the evening right here.
I just have a practical question. Do you anticipate hearing from any of these people? And how are you going to handle that?
Well, hopefully not. Hopefully not on the block. No, yeah, a few of them. So one of the people that I wrote about a lot was a guy named Mike Cernovich, who is kind of like again, like a kind of punchline on the internet in many ways, but is also extremely influential in ways that is not fun to hear about. You don't want to hear that the guy who is a punchline on Twitter is like actually shaping your news on a daily basis. He wrote a review that was not positive. And a few people have kind of written some one-star Amazon reviews that I was like, I'm no like forensic speech expert, but I think I know who wrote this. Like, I think that the person who's very concerned with how one particular character in the book is portrayed. So there have been that kind of stuff, and there are people who kind of follow me around on Twitter, but generally there was one person who was like, like following me around on Twitter saying, you have factual inaccuracies in your book about me. And I was like, that's weird because you didn't respond to my fact checkers at all. And then she went away. So there have been a few of those. But no, I mean, I think to the extent that they thought, to the extent that they actually thought they were going to red pill me, either they were joking or they now realize how dumb that was. And I think that because of these mistakes that journalists have been making for a while with attempts to seem even-handed, it has created this false norm that all a journalist can do is write down what you said and just sort of give a little sort of weak, quick encapsulation of it, and that's it. So I think on some level, some of them, the more naive ones of them, thought that was what it was going to be. It was going to be someone sort of wrinkling his nose lightly in disapproval and quoting them and just sort of saying, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. And when the book was more than that, I think this is projection, but I think they felt dumb. Like, I think they were like, oh, that was always naive of us. And I think that to protest about that too much would just draw attention to their miscalculation. Either that or they just haven't read it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause for Andrew and Vinson.
Guys.
Thank you so much, guys.